the museum because Carol has such interesting shows. And I've been here earlier, other times for book events as well. I like to think I was here and working with Philip Johnson in the mid-'80s, as was Christian Bioni in the back there. I like to think, as far as Carol's comment, that I was involved in and responsible for some of the postmodern work. I like to think that, with no disrespect to the younger members of the audience here, that in your 20s you're forgiven everything. So things evolve in your life and you pick up things and customize, as everybody knows. But basically this was an interesting book for me. It's actually a second book on tall buildings. I'd written a first book between about 2006 and 2008. I'd put together a book called Tall Building, Imagining the Skyscraper. And Carol might have been complimenting the size of this book because that other book was about this big and you had to have a piece of luggage to sort of carry it around. And she commented on it, and I think I listened. And it is more usable, and that's a good thing. But that book was really more about the tall building as a cultural artifact. And I was addressing the symbolism, the semantics of tall buildings, what they're like, the crush of new tall luxury condominiums and what that says about tall buildings and who wants them, and hip new hotels and what's the sociology of that. There's a whole set of skyscraper projects or tall building projects that were done by artists, actually, because they were obsessed with this idea of tall buildings. So it was more kind of understanding all the commentary, the qualitative things, the ideas, the imagination, thus the title, Tall Building, Imagining the Skyscraper. So I finished the book. I was ready to finish the book, and I did some book tours, some talking. I went back to my office and I began to work on some tall buildings, and I realized, like within a year or two at the most, that actually, and it wasn't in a day that I saw this, there are people here who work on tall buildings, so these things are gradual, but I realized that it was all changing, that everything was changing, and I came to interpret actually that book. Now remember, it came out in 2008, so things just kind of went like that as the book came out, and at least for a few moments we all thought, there were people calling me from news companies saying, well, Mr. Johnson, will there ever be any more tall buildings? I mean, that was the kind of questions that were being asked, so it seemed an extreme moment, and maybe not the most perfect moment to come out with a building on tall buildings, so people were questioning whether they would even exist. We all, probably everyone here, understand cities and density and growth well enough to know they're not going away anytime soon. They'll only continue in various prototypes and configurations. But when I came back to my office, I realized that there were a number of things going on that were, I would call them, quantitative in nature rather than particularly qualitative. And among those things, our attention on developing the buildings, and my colleagues was not, in other offices, was not solely or even fundamentally about form making necessarily. There were other things of equivalent importance to us. It was very much about the tools we were using and the capability of these digital tools and what they could do. It was with these digital tools, and we had the ability to measure and record infinitesimal things now. And because we could now record that, of course, we could share that with the team. So the process became immensely iterative, what I call hyper-iterative. If you thought you would do something and send it to somebody, and then a week or two later they would send something, forget about it. It was iterative over the course of a day, many times over the course of the day. I said this, yeah, but you said this, but can we say this? Well, no, I meant this, well, and just back and forth. And if you imagine that in the context of designing a tall building or a big anything, that's a very different process, and it's an extremely complex one. Add that to working overseas, which meant that a lot of us were doing global practices now. And working overseas meant that while you were sleeping, if you were sleeping, things were going on and iterating. So when you came in the morning, there was all this stuff that you spent your first hour or two going through that to see where you really were as opposed to where you thought you were the night before. So many things had happened. But looking back at it and thinking about the period of Carol's show here on Times Square, if we look at the last 50 years of the 20th century, the only books that I could think of that were interested in kind of the hardware of the period were Siegfried Gideon's 1948 book, Mechanization Takes Command, and then about 20 years later, Rainer Banham did Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment, And those were books about kind of the hardware that makes buildings and how that relates to form. But mostly we hadn't been talking about that. We talked about cultural things and how these buildings deal with those. So I realized that the first book wasn't necessarily irrelevant, but to me, the practice was changing so much that I had to think about it in a different way and ultimately write about it in a different way. Now, the one thing I need to say at the outset of this is that the book is Performative Skyscrapers, Tall Building Design Now. I don't believe that that's the only thing that tall buildings are doing. They're doing all the rest too, but that issue of performativity has sort of come to the top of the pile. I also say, and I need to say this up front because sometimes this is misunderstood, I also don't believe because we have more precise tools and we can locate things and we can impose what we want to do with such precision that makes us better architecture or ensures that the architecture is better equipped. I don't believe that at all. It still remains, in my view, an elusive aspect, transformational architecture, and its sources are still to some degree unknown, so we're talking about tools and capability of tools. But in the ways I mentioned a moment before, they have completely changed the way we interact in creating a large work of architecture, in this case, tall buildings. So what I'm going to do, and I'm going to be brief, I think. I probably have more slides than I'm going to talk about, so we're going to kind of pass some of them because I'd like to, I know there's architects here, and I'd like to maximize the time that we talk about it and hear some thoughts that you have on this. Being iterative here would be interesting to me. But basically the book is 5 chapters, different ways to visualize or think about performativity. And the first chapter, and I'm going to cue Ryan here, the first chapter is about performative ecologies. And I'll confess, I am interested in form making and how technologies appear and how we experience them. And this, of course, is the Arab World Institute from 1987 in Paris by Jean Nouvel. And it was, I'm not sure what I thought about it at the time, this highly mechanistic mashrabiyah, this sort of Arab lattice window that adjusted. It's rusted now. If you've been there recently, it doesn't move anymore. So much metal over so many years. But it moved and it closed and opened in a kind of a Muslim pattern to admit light and heat and to close it down when the sun rotated. So it was a very smart thing. But looking back at it now with the time that we have to think about it, it was still very much engaging sort of the cultural aspects of the program. Next. Something very different a few years later. This is Hegau by Helmut Jahn in Singen, Germany. The epitome of modern thinking, crisp, Cartesian, clean, mechanistic. It sort of has shed, not that Helmut Jahn would ever not shed, but completely shed any kind of residue of culture. It's an object, it's a product really, and it's stainless steel meshes that operate. It's operate and control glare, control light, and with light control heat, and on a perfect grid. Another way of sort of thinking about the building's adaptability to ecology and climate. Next. And then more recently, and I think more profoundly as we move forward, are buildings that actually function more like organism biomimesis. They operate in an organic method to interface with the ecologies that they're in. This is a building by Cloud9 in Barcelona, a fairly recent building. And on its northern facades, as you can see on the right, one of the north-facing facades, it's open and clear and maximum glass. On the other southerly 2 sides, it's largely protected. It's protected by ETFE, which is a polymeric plastic pillow. You've seen this in the swimming cube, the water cube in Beijing in 2008. These pillows are silk screened. They're filled with a gas which is mostly nitrogen, which expands with heat sensors, fills it up. It causes it to vaporize. It allows light to pass through but cuts glare as it diffuses the glass because it has kind of translucency behind it. And then there are other areas where larger spaces are not filled with this kind of tile, and there's almost a reptilian organic quality to how this matters. So you see 3 buildings over the course of 20 plus years, almost 30 years actually, that manifest themselves differently in interfacing with ecology. Next. Very recently, the Abu Dhabi Investment Council has done a building which, and you've probably seen it's been much featured, but these are basically 2,000 triangular flower petals that are exoskeletal the window. The architects did not want to either coat the glass, that's to say to tint it, or to put a reflective coating on it. They wanted to maximize natural light when they could, so they made the choice of wrapping a shroud, optimizing the petals into 15 different petals, which then open and close in various degrees of aperture depending on the rotation of the sun. So the building exterior moves, the interior building stays fixed, and when the sun isn't there, you get full view, or literally full view. When the sun is there at a certain point, at a high point of exposure, it's quite opaque and closed. So there's, again, a building that's interacting with the climate. In Los Angeles, there's a young group of architects. Doris Sung is one of them. Who's experimenting with biothermals. These are metals, which this is something that has existed in product design, but not in architecture, and even yet it hasn't really, to my knowledge, made it into architecture. This is a very large mock-up, architectural in scale, but it still hasn't been applied, and it's taking two metals with different thermal coefficients of expansion and putting them together so that when the sun hits it, the light is converted to heat. They bend or they move at different levels. It causes them to curl in ways that allow openings to occur to ventilate off of the interior surface, or actually to shade if they go into a closed position. This is a very experimental thing. I think that we'll know more about it as it's understood further, but you can see the kind of the formal possibilities for some of this. And this is a mock-up that Doris has made. It's about 2 years old. Next. There are a series of case studies in the book about aerodynamics and wind power. This is a building in Wuhan, a tall building by Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill, and they've done a number, as of other architects, but that look at the aerodynamics. The vectors on the right-hand side show you kind of the acceleration zones of how frequently on a tall building the vortices will be vertical at the top. Anytime there's a bend or a corner or a turn, there are a lot of things happen with wind, but by softening the corners, it actually accelerates the wind speed. By creating apertures, it can accelerate. We all know the Venturi effect, accelerate, heighten the concentration of energy, and then capture it through turbines. There's a discussion in the book about these, but they obviously have implications on the kind of the formal generation of the building type. Next. And then there, in the end of this chapter, are looking a bit at kind of biomorphic architecture. This happens to be Ken Yang on the left, someone who has spent some 30-plus years kind of mining this idea of tall buildings that actually would allow the groundscape to grow up through them. They're highly cavernous. He's a Malaysian architect principally, and from his original house for himself 30 years ago, through a series of both, I would say, proposal projects as well as a few actual projects, he's continued to mine this area of deep shade, cross-ventilation, indoor-outdoor spaces, and bringing the bioforms up through the building to oxygenate the shaft of the building. On the right is Mario Cuccinelli at Tsinghua University in Beijing for a demonstration building there. We're looking at the southerly facade there, and we're seeing obviously the horizontal shading racks, racks for photovoltaics, the idea of the sun, the oxygenation, and the plant material on that facade, kind of how permeable that is. Similar buildings doing similar things in different ways. Next. Performative skins. The prior chapter was somewhat about skins, but this goes into a little bit more detail about skins. And probably most of us know this, but in my view, glass is really the preeminent material, the persistent material. We know the history of 19th century drawn glass from garden structures and pavilions and arcades and all of that. Coming into the 20th century with modernism, some of the most notable architects, this is a proposal that many of you recognize from Mies van der Rohe for Friedrichstrasse in Berlin from 1921, and it was virtually an all-glass building. Le Corbusier's Plan Radius showed Cartesian buildings that were supposed, he didn't say much about it, but they were drawn as if they were all glass. And Gropius's Dessau Bauhaus was all glass on one facade, on several facades actually. So glass was being experimented with, it was exciting. The issues with glass, of course, are that it maximizes view and it maximizes visibility, and the issues become complicated, particularly today and for the last few decades, because the issue is to mitigate the climatic interface and the impact of temperature and climate on the glass. Next. Many people have experimented with it, and I don't have time to go through the full contents of the book, but an apartment building in Montreal fairly recently where there are vertical spindles on the exterior of the building, and on those are a series of metal fans that are perforated that turn based on what the occupant wishes. If they wish views through, it's triangular. If they wish views through, if they wish to close out the light, and they can modulate it. If they wish to reflect sun into the unit, they can operate these to do that. On the right is a fairly widely published building, not that new now. I think about 2000, end of the 1990s, with the rebuilding of Berlin, Saarbrücken and Hutton. It was a corporate office building, but you can see in the upper portion there's an interstitial window wall of about a meter. So the glass line is a meter, and there are these large fins, you see, which sit out within the exo frame, and they can be manipulated by occupants, again, to shade. They're perforated, so you can still actually see through them. From the outside here, it looks like they're fully opaque, but from the inside, you can see through them, and you can modulate. So these are buildings that allow the interior and the folks on the inside to be able to modulate not just the climatic impact on them, but the formal resolution of the building. Next. Christoph Ingenhoven from Germany has done 8 buildings already, maybe more, 8 that I know of. This is one of them. This actually happens to be in Sydney, but has really pioneered the double window wall. Arup has done a lot of this work with him and has gone on to further engineer the double window wall a plenum. This is a section cut through one of his buildings where the light and heat is here, the second window wall is here, the glazing, the visibility is through. Normally these ventilate up through, so any heat, in the case of hotter climates, this generated here is naturally ventilated and it keeps heat off of the inside. So it's like a building that wears a parka in a way, but a transparent parka. In colder climates, which is where generally Christoph works, he uses it because of the ambient temperature and the ability to keep cold off of the interior, the third surface, 1, 2, 3, 4, the third surface of glass. And then more experimental pieces. These are the pillows, the ETFE pillows I mentioned on the right from Mediatek in Barcelona. This is from the Shanghai Expo 2010. Again, a polymer fabric with a selection of apertures for window visibility. Next. One of the things that interests me a lot is, and I think everybody's observed this, particularly people in New York, where the densities accrue, the value of the land becomes important, and the ability to process information becomes highly valuable, particularly in an advertising environment. I realize by looking at this picture now that this has to be several years old because it's highly static, and most of the stuff now, which is changing, the technology for this is completely different. It's basically LED based, but buildings are beginning to have carry an enormous amount of information because of the relative value of that information. That says a lot of things about the city, but it says a lot of things about the service economy and the intellectual product that we all produce. But it's a reminder that this has been in play for a long time. This is the House of Publicity by Nietzsche from 1936 in Paris, and he was always already imagining that a merchant building could actually express things and sell things and talk about things. And now fast forward a long way, and it's happening really in every city. It's actually happening in Los Angeles, which has a relatively low density. It's happening in the core, in the downtown area, for those of you that know Los Angeles. And in fact, we have a situation where our property prices are not as high as New York. So actually, in the areas of highest density in downtown Los Angeles, the value per square foot of the window wall is more valuable than the actual square footage of the space, which is the reason, in theory, the building was built. So we had a client recently who was told to build an apartment building across from Staples Arena, which is kind of in the center. And he was told in the last minute that that Clear Channel would just buy the whole building if they could have the exterior, and he wouldn't have to even use it as an apartment building. I could only imagine how difficult a choice that was for someone who's financially motivated. For me, it was no question. For him, it was hard. But he made the right decision. But it's a strange inversion when the value of the face of the building is more valuable than actually the rentable square footage. It's an interesting thing to think about where that goes. Next. This is a building by UN Studio, and they've done several, actually. Ben Van Berkel's done several. I've seen several in Kaohsiung, Taiwan. This is in China, Xianan, that have embedded, and this is some of the more advanced technology, embedded LED systems, so we can do at least usually low resolution video. That could be advertising, that could be imagery, that could be art, but basically, particularly by night, that the entire facade can change. Next. Sometimes, like in the case of this building in Singapore, it's a podium which is retail. There's a parking in the podium, and there's a Cineplex in it. So in essence, very little of the building wants to be transparent. It's solid. So it's really very decorative. It's not my particularly favorite building for a lot of those reasons, but again, illumination, LED, liquid crystals are part of the technology that illuminate and give content to the exterior of the building. And then a project I thought was quite advanced at the time, Doug Aitken, the artist, working at MoMA, and this was 2007, in which he sort of showed private lives in large LED screens around MoMA on the exterior and on the interior, and showed that it's probably from within an artistic realm. There's really no regulation or limitation as to what the content is that could be sold, or at least we don't know that there is. The project on the right was his project of the same year called Manhattan Air Rights, and he had gone into, I believe it was the Midtown East, an area of interest now for other reasons, and had generated a map of what the full, complete air rights would be for every building that was there, including the lower, smaller buildings that weren't fully utilizing their air rights. And he made that drawing to show how different the city would be if everyone could build their air rights. And because it was done in conjunction with this project, the suggestion was, of course, well, if someone wanted to put content on those walls, you can imagine the massive amount of information that would be generated through the public right-of-way. Next. Performative parametrics. Sometimes this is what everybody thinks about when they think about performance. These days, everybody's office is full of scripting and writing code and 3D printing and software. But I think that this has brought a whole other aspect. It's really just one part of the performance issue. And I maintain that it's performance as a noun, as an object. Performance doesn't equate to quality necessarily. That's up to us to do that. We'll go next. Yeah. This is a project, again, by UN Studio, Guangzhou. It was Raffles City, the 7th project. And the principles there, we're trying to do many things. It's a podium building, a shopping entertainment podium with 2 towers. The towers are, they're mixed use, so they have office in the lower portion, they have hotel and residence above. So they have multiple cores in the center. So they bulge at the bottom and they get smaller, but there's a desire to make them tortile. As soon as they become tortile, then they activate the surface because their relationship to the sun changes in a very fluid way. You see some of the prototyping and mapping that they're doing on the right. I think the next image shows us, next image shows us some of the issues. This is an exaggerated view here on the left, but it shows that it's bigger and as cores drop off, it gets smaller. You see the plan sections up to the top. Most importantly, what happens is in the east and west hemispheres, the shading is vertical. As it rotates into the southern hemisphere, it turns horizontal because the sun is high and running directly against the glass. So the efficiency, if you will, the performativity of the shading system actually articulates a fluid rotation of these batters, and you're seeing a little piece of it up in the upper right. But again, it's a way of taking the form and then mapping the sun's impact and then responding through a series of baffles. Next. Much talked about building the Fair Tower in La Défense, Paris by Morphosis and Tom Main. And I think that this project is very interesting for what it shows about idealization and versus optimization. You all may remember when this came out, it was 2007, it was that long ago. Hasn't been built, but it's gone through a process of further design and constructability. This was the image of it, and the next image is going to show kind of some of the work that was done on it. There was the ability to map the shape with great precision and differentiation, but initially the project ended up as a diagrid. There was a structural diagrid, much like Norman Foster has used, because it more uniformly spreads the structural forces. And then the exterior skin, because it also morphed to follow the shape, was triangulated so it could be tessellated to make these shapes. And where we are today, as I understand it from Tom, is closer to the end, which is to say that all the skin members are flat now. They're all rectangular. They basically take their fluid form by changing the distance between the panels. So everything is absorbed in the panel joint rather than in the panel itself. So it's the kind of optimization, if the top is parametric modeling to envision or design or conceive of a project, then the post-rationalization, or the optimization as I call it, to make it buildable or conveyable is really what the bottom piece shows. In the end, an infinite number of panels might be conceivable, but it's perhaps not possible or probable to build it that way. Next. And then a building that you all know here by Frank Gehry, 8 Spruce. And in Frank's case, Ryan, we'll go ahead. You probably know his office. We went over to his office, and I asked him if he would show us his model. This is some of his models for this project. And Frank always works three-dimensionally, more or less by hand. He builds things physically, and then historically he's mapped it. He on this particular project, they worked through Rhino datum surfaces, and then they went into CATIA, and then they went into DP, which they use now, and digital projects. And you can see some of the pieces were tortile. Some of his earliest ideas were very tortile and shaped. At some point, sort of the development of the core and the units were developed. This is, as you know, a residential building, so there's metrics involved in that. And then you see the big models were really about surfaces onto cubic forms. And there's a whole range of things in here, but you've seen it, you know what it is now. And it's really a T in plan, which fits the site, fits the adjoining streets, and then it's modeled in very specific elevations. And the next, like I mentioned with Tom and Morphos's Fair Tower, again, there's a rationalization process that tries to identify flat panels, panels with some complexity, and panels with more complexity. It grades them. There are floor-by-floor curtain wall units rather than long stick systems, so it can be put up in a unitized way. And then there's a metal system, an aluminum system that goes over and expresses the curves on those elevations that have curves. And then there's an exterior wall, which is a series of sheets, stainless steel, that then gets riveted to what's behind it. But all the windows are flat and straight, and they've also all flat in various orientations, but very muscular, very rich. And in Frank's case, I think it's a very accurate evolution of his physical modeling conception. Next. Next to last chapter, Performative Neighborhoods. This is a chapter of which I spoke in the first book, actually, because it interests me a lot. It's about mixed-use vertical buildings. There has been in the United States, maybe less so in New York, but in the United States in general, in the West, a penchant for single-use buildings. The economics of that kind of frequently prevail. But in Asia, it's not true. In other parts of Europe, it hasn't been necessarily true. And it's interesting, going back, some of the first examples of mixed-use towers. This is a famous example, Frank Lloyd Wright's Mile High Tower. It was part of the Broadacres City moment for him. He was 86 years old, and he told us that this would be a mile-high tower. It would have 6 million square feet. I think the interesting thing about it is he said, It would, I forget how many thousands of residences would be in it. There'd be office space, there'd be a hotel. He said there'd be concert halls and cultural venues. And yet when you look at the building, there's no expression of any of that, right? It's one sleek, unified single form, notwithstanding the narrative and the program of what it is. I think this was kind of the beginning of thinking in the West in a very pure realm what it meant to be mixed use. The next one I'm going to show you is John Hancock Tower, which you know in Chicago, and by Fazlur Khan and Bruce Graham at SOM, Chicago office. And the building is 40 stories of office, and then residence, and then restaurant, and then an observation deck. And it cants in slightly, it batters because of the size of an office floor plate as conceived then, and then the size of a floor plate for the residences. And other than that, that's the only giveaway. The other giveaway is the floor-to-floor height from floor to floor. It slightly varies as you see it. But again, conceptually, you know, the office was thinking about it as a single monolithic piece rather than expressing its differences. And that seemed to be where we as architects or our fathers or grandfathers, in whatever your case may be, conceived as mixed-use buildings in the West. On the right is Millennium Tower, Tokyo Bay by Norman Foster. And again, it was a super tall building, but it was conceived as one piece, and this had a whole city in it. And it was sitting out on the bay outside of Tokyo. What amuses me is the big cutouts you see here, and then knowing that the space was actually a donut with atrias inside. That obviously prefigured his Commerce Bank, which he developed about 20 years ago. You may know it in Frankfurt, where it sits and has the triangular, the octagonal openings with the 5-story high atriums in the center. He was obviously in that zone when he was thinking about this. But still, it's one form rather than multiple forms. It doesn't really give the program expression. Although an immensely tragic act, 9/11 created so much conversation, so many levels of exhibition, competitions, that on the intellectual front, I think it did many things to kind of open up the conversation. And in the nature of mixed-use verticality, there were many of the projects which had public functions up in the midsections of the towers or on the tops of the towers. They had open spaces. In some cases, they had galleries and public streets up off the ground level connecting the tops of buildings, and cores that allowed you to pass laterally as well as vertically. And I think that was an interesting contribution to the idea of mixed-use towers. Peter Eisenman had earlier in the late 80s made his idea about kind of the skyscraper with the Max Reinhardt house in Berlin. And you can see through the section there that in addition to the fractal donut through the middle, there's a series of, and mostly assembly spaces, theatrical spaces, but occupancy, large occupancy, taller vertical open spaces within the typical repetitive floor of the section. And this building, in my view, was then later was actualized. It was never built, of course, but it was actualized. Ryan, we'll go to the next. By CCTV, China National Television, by Oman Rem Koolhaas. Again, Rem's rant that it was the non-skyscraper, was the death of the skyscraper, which was the underpinnings for that building, a kind of a mobile building with cores and multiple uses within it. Had no top any longer. It was a continuous form. So again, another contribution to the occupancy of mixed use in a tall building form. One person I just want to point out in this who's always had an abiding interest in mixed use form, and this isn't exactly a tall building. This is maybe a tall building on its side. But all the early schemes, Stephen Hole for Simmons Hall at MIT, which is a dormitory, and you may know of it, right overlooking the Charles River, had all kinds of three-dimensional spaces and common student meeting spaces within it. It was pulled back, it was somewhat reduced, but the residue of that intellectual thought is still in the building with outdoor spaces that are large, 3 cores that service vertically, horizontal connections that tie into the 3 cores, and then lounges and common spaces at various points through the building. So it was a beginning of an idea. Stephen has carried it further and into tall buildings. It's never gone away. Dramatically, Any of you, if you had been to the Olympics in Beijing in 2008, this wasn't quite finished, but it was very visible on the major highway from the airport to the third ring road, or the center of Beijing. And it's 8 mostly residential towers with a street connecting all the upper pieces, and the idea that there should be common space, some amount of retail and some amount of service up in there, like Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation. That level still struggles to this day to get retail and get the kind of density up there. But again, it was a further theorization of his idea that one day there would be enough density, people would be living in tall buildings, and there would be multiple lateral levels. And I think it's quite interesting in that way. More recently in Chengdu, sliced porosity block. You can see in the bottom how he's folding planes to try to nuance ground level circulation, up and up and up and up and up in the bottom portion. But the section shows that actually all the orange is public space, that he's intending to bring the bottom half of the buildings, try to publicize that and create multiple points of access through it. So he continues to, among other things he's interested in, try to develop mixed-use activity and interface in the tall building form. Okay. Rex, theoretical project for Korea, and the idea of kind of buildings as slices that have interrelationships with other buildings, these being residential buildings, rooftops, outdoor spaces, visibility between walls, connecting multiple buildings as super projects are built. And then end the chapter on the idea of articulation and definition. Is it possible? It's kind of a conundrum. This was one of many projects that were done as commentary on MoMA's efforts to build a tower. And the idea, could you ever articulate functions? Is that possible? Is it desirable? Would it make it instantly obsolete? I think it raises as many questions as it answers. On the right, the major telecom giant in Mumbai. If you've been to Mumbai, you've seen this building. If you've been to this downtown core, the bottom of the bay, I believe, as I understand it, it's still unoccupied, but it's a design of a tall building for a family of 6 people, and probably lots of service people as well. But the idea of the meaningfulness of articulating something, or the relevance of it over time. Okay. The last chapter, and I'll end on this, is a brief, because it has to be brief. Cities are complicated things with enormous histories, cultural histories, but just looking at, very topically, how buildings, it's tempting to see tall buildings as generic and non-city specific, because there's a group of professionals globally who make them. There is, to some degree, a global science and engineering of the knowledge base that we all use to work with. And there is, in the case of commercial tall buildings, there is a global community of real estate investors and developers who look for opportunities. So there's a lot of global continuity, neutrality, in my view, to that. But undergirding every city are a lot of specifics that cause those buildings to have to operate differently, or, if you will, perform differently. Now, I'm not here to tell New Yorkers about New York, but I follow it closely and with great interest, because it tends in some ways to prefigure what happens in other cities. One thing that is obvious to people who study zoning is that the major zoning changes in New York City, the 1916 light and air zoning, the 1961 and the 1982, these were all major watersheds in rewriting zoning codes. Within a very few years after New York did it, many other major cities in New York, in the country also rewrote theirs along very similar lines. I don't know that means everyone's following New York, but it means that there's a conversation amongst professionals about what's the zeitgeist of the time and what matters in terms of building out cities. During Bloomberg, of course, he looked out, and the city looked out to 2030. There's much to be said about this, pro and con, but obviously densification was added. There was ability to generate higher densities based on a development district fee, if you will, for additional density bonus. There was also, in my view, just as a designer, an infatuation emerging on super tall buildings. I don't know what to credit that to. We all might have our opinions. It might be that Asia and the developing ascendant countries were doing it, and we weren't doing it too much, actually. We were not building the tallest buildings, but there has become a real interest in doing tall buildings. I know that mayors such as Ken Livingstone in London at his time, and Bloomberg has talked about the need to develop Class A office space. So international service firms would have space that they would come and take multiple floors. There's that whole, the program of the occupancy argument. But it's been bold, it's big, there's a lot of density. New York, to someone who comes from Los Angeles and some other cities, has quite a lot of infrastructure in place, public infrastructure. You have very lousy traffic, but you still have a lot more infrastructure than many cities have. And so there's been an infatuation at some level with that. Next. Tokyo is a city, and I'm just touching on these very briefly. I encourage you to read the book and even research further. But Tokyo is a city that had two opportunities to design or redesign or create a master plan and establish zoning. 1923, the great Kanto earthquake, which decimated much of the city, and then after World War II, of course, where they were rebuilding major cities, including Tokyo. They declined both of those opportunities. They never generated a master plan. The vast majority of buildings in Tokyo are as of right. Generally, historically, the tall buildings that we see that make up the cityscape of Tokyo were not required to pay any fees or make any contributions to public infrastructure. So something slightly less than 5% of the city is public open space, compared to New York, which is considerably higher, I'm sure you know. So Japan has chosen to, the government has chosen historically to support growth and reconstruction, has supported the corporation, the Japanese large corporation, and national organizations. So unwittingly, it looks like this. There's some interesting works of architecture. In my view, they tend to be episodic. I think Thomas Struth's photograph, the next photograph, Ryan, of Shinjuku, which is one of the business centers of Tokyo, kind of shows the potential banality of being able to build as of right, having just a corporate sponsor, having no dialogue with the community or planning professionals. It's kind of a remarkable photograph, and there's much else, of course, of Tokyo in tall buildings, but this is a significant part of the fabric of the city. There are other cities, this happens to be Abu Dhabi, but which are ascendant and aspirational, nationalistic, and sort of attuned to both the ability to build as well as the aspiration of national pride. In the case of Abu Dhabi, there's a strong interest to also pluralize or multiply the basis of their economy. Their first oil and fossil fuel trade industry happened between 1960 and 1970, and that wasn't that long ago if you think about a city making itself. So the majority of what you see and what's new has happened since then as money has come in through trade. The new projects are tall, sometimes super tall. They're highly idealized, and they've given us projects like the Burj Khalifa, which is actually in Dubai, but named for the Emir of Abu Dhabi, Khalifa, who's the Emir of that emirate. The two cities are worth comparison because they're near each other, and they are historically the territory of two families, one Bedouin, one non-Bedouin, with very different personalities. But they're attempting to rebuild their city from scratch and quickly. Much has been said about these cities. Next. Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo is the third largest metropolis in the world with 27 million inhabitants. It had no zoning until 1972 when it got its first zoning, and has virtually no public infrastructure. It has very little bike trails, very little open space, and yet it's famous for all the squatting that goes around. Much is talked about the impromptu residential areas around the edges, going up into the green belts and into the environmentally sensitive areas, but it's not always talked about the fact that because the center of the city is eroding so quickly, about 20% of the central core of Sao Paulo is actually empty or reoccupied by people who aren't registered to be there or to live there. So next, and I think the last photograph, gives a contrast to the ascendant cities on the Gulf as an example. Cities in some case, denigration and destruction. This shows a squatter's occupancy in an existing building above. And there is just now, in the last 5 to 8 years, an attempt for the city to acknowledge that they can't afford to have the center of their city fall apart, and they have just revamped the central market. They're beginning to build bike trails. They're putting money into ground level retail and startups. So we'll see where it goes, but it's a huge effort. And it does remind us that if we don't rebuild our cities and our tall buildings and our infrastructure, basically, and I'm reminded of the 60s and the 70s with Archigram about the walking city. That was a metabolic sort of vision at the time. But when you look at some of the developing and struggling cities around the world, which are so large, you wonder if the city might just walk away. In fact, the new towers in Sao Paulo are not in the center anymore. They've moved elsewhere where there's more safety, there's more amenity, nearer to residences and mixed use. So hard to imagine in New York, but in another kind of city, the city actually could walk away and move somewhere else, leaving the city to others or no one. So with that, I'll end my comments. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'd be delighted to hear any comments. I know there are a lot of people here that are both interested and are involved in tall building design. Any thoughts? Yes.
Most of us here are probably involved in the skyscraper business for Chiunter. I was also relieved to hear you say that performative-driven architecture is not always translated to aesthetics or to quality. Some of the things that I see are atrocious, but they're driven by money, they're driven by architects' fascination with materials and the bending of things and the heat transfer of things. And when I'm having trouble appreciating performative architecture under the terms of better living, real housing, because some of these super skyscrapers that are being built, especially in Manhattan, foreigners are buying the apartments. They're not living in these apartments maybe twice or 3 times a year. Most of them sit empty, waiting for wealthy wealthy purchasers to come and buy them. Is that housing? It looks fantastic, it looks iconic, but it's spiritless and just, precious materials involved in building this architecture. So the problem I'm having is, has an architecture or architects always been involved or focused on performance in the materials of buildings? I mean, we know the elevator transformed things for us. We know certain ceramic bricks things helped with heat and control and ventilation, all this stuff. So how different are we focused on performance of material and concepts today than we were in the last 100 years?
Well, I think performance isn't one thing, it's many things. Performance in the hands of some designers might be a form-making exercise. No names, but those of you who follow architecture can think of people who exercise form with no particular regard to program maybe or social purpose, some of the things you're mentioning. My goal wasn't to put a sort of a moral imprint in this book. If you want to ask me my opinion about how relevant those are to certain social purposes, I'd be happy to have that conversation. But it was really just to redefine how invasive the idea of performance is. It's more than a software program. It's now kind of the lingua franca of how we interact. Now, building super tall condominiums that sell for $80 million in Manhattan I don't know if that's housing or not. They're not there, I guess it's not housing.
They call them residential.
Well, that's a definitional zoning issue, okay, and so that's that. But performance, for example, on the development of a skin or a building that's now imagined to be more organic and responsive, that cuts its carbon load by 90%, that sort of thing, you might agree that that's worth pursuing, and that might be something that you might think has social purpose, where being able to build taller and bigger at a higher price point, therefore only the people who have that kind of money can be there, that isn't. I'm happy to differentiate these things, but my goal in the book was really just to talk about performance as more than a 3D program. It's actually kind of prevailing throughout the culture at this moment. It seems to me it's interesting that from World War II virtually until, let's say, the last 10 years, when parametrics and performativity started to be talking about that, and I would welcome anybody to think of another source, but I mentioned Siegfried Gideon and Rainer Banham. Nobody talked about the mechanics of a building, right? I mean, everybody wanted to talk about sort of the cultural aspects, the aesthetic aspects. We went through a whole series of modern, late modern, postmodern, deconstructivist, late modern came back, pluralism, regional, however you define that. But no one talked about the tools of the building virtually in 50, 60 years. We're back to talking about tools of the building, but also the tools. I think you could make a perfect case that the buildings become, from an architectural point of view, the buildings become a metaphor of the tools. Was there a reason why buildings in the 20s and 30s looked the way they were? Because they were always modeled in the materials they were modeled. And is there a reason why the buildings today look the way they look? Because they're all done in three-dimensional software or code, and they're all transmitted immediately to the 3D printer, and they're just made like that. Nobody puts a hand on them. Yeah, that's going to be a different process. There's going to be a different outcome. But again, I have lots of personal opinions about it, but I was really more interested in kind of the magnitude and the breadth of the change. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes?
So I wonder if you'd comment. It's not a question, it's just an observation. I'm in New York. I'm not an architect. I just love New York. I go to lectures.
It's a problem.
That's what I do. And I ride my bike around New York, and I notice stuff, So I notice on the west side, they're building these gigantic buildings, following what Trump did a little further up. On the west side now, it's further down over the railroad yards. They got these big rectangles, and they're miles high, and they got 10 zillion people living in there on the one hand. And then you go downtown near the Woolworth building, and at times this weekend, they're talking about $130 million, the top 3 floors in the Woolworth building is going to rent for. Anybody see that article in the, and then uptown at Madison Square, you got the toy building north, that's now Witkoff is making. They built 2 buildings up on top. So you got the new that looks regular, and then you got the old that they're reconfining, and then you got buildings like the Whitney, the new school, the Cooper Union new building, the Bryant Park building across from Bryant Park, and one where you got 3 different kinds. Where are we going? Is it all over the place? What do you think?
That was a lot of stuff. And probably all of you would have maybe a more timely response than me. It's probably going everywhere. It's probably going, in my view, there are many things that are happening at the same time. That's normal, and that's probably good. New York has always, even from the time that I lived here, has suffered, benefited, whatever, from the fact that it's on an island. It's restricted. I understand the boroughs and all that, but that, and it's highly desirable to lots of people. Unfortunately, many people are excluded from being able to live there or participate, and that's deeply unfortunate. I don't think the various administrations have focused on that very aggressively. But that's the problem, and it moves people to the outside and the outside and the outside. So I think there's a problem, there's a fundamental sociological and zoning problem with that. I know the rest of the cities in America would love to see New York solve that in an aggressive way, because we tend to look to New York and we tend to some degree ape the zoning and some of the initiatives. Did you have a comment on his comment?
Yeah, just it's a collage city, which is a book that Fred Coder and Colin Rowe wrote about 30 or 40 years ago now. There are different idealized cities, and they're all clashing into each other. and that's part of the diversity of urban life.
Yeah, I actually appreciate it, but now I live in Los Angeles, so consider the source. You know, rather than overriding enormously defined and precise urban design guidelines, I prefer the notion of kind of a multivalent city with different things happening. I mean, I think you have to be neighborly. There are the frameworks to operate in, but I'm for less definition than more. So.
I was interested in your this last comment about the tools being the image or the metaphor for the building that unites the idea of performativity, right? So before you said that, I was going to ask the question, what do you think, or what factors do you think have been motivating this, which you see as a broad approach, but might be driven by such things as parametric design and BIM and so building management systems in order to build taller buildings more efficiently among the various partners of the team of construction? Is it, I mean, by suggesting it's the expression, the physical, the formal expression of tools, it sort of suggests that the motivation, you mentioned sustainability, which is one thing I would associate with performative buildings, that they are trying to be more efficient for what some people might call moral reasons. And you know, I agree with that as an agenda of architecture, which has been introduced broadly into the profession. So you can answer that. I might put Abar's on the spot, since he's written an article about parametric design. If you think parametric design, maybe you might say what you think it is, and do you think it's much different than performative in the way that Scott's presented it tonight?
Well, I mean, I think, well, for one thing, there's a very loaded, because we use them quite a lot, like the last 10 years, this issue of, like, there's one side that is the tools, right? We've got a lot more precision, a lot more tools that connect and talk to each other, that allows us to do things that, say, for instance, when you talk about environmental design, now you can quantify, you can do overall energy analysis much faster than, 10 years ago, like 40 years ago, it was just blue arrows and red arrows. You draw a section, you said the so they work. Now, I want to understand if it really works or not, and I can. So that gives me actually that I cannot just do arrows and get away with it. I would have to quantify that. And actually today I came back from teaching a class at Pratt on efficiency and tall buildings, and one of the issues we were talking there is carbon footprint. Everybody's talking about how buildings perform in terms of energy save. They say energy savings, but I say you don't save any energy. It's like Macy's telling you save $200, I just spent $500. It's not energy savings, it's actually you are spending energy. You might be spending less. So we're looking at the overall embodied energy of building it in the first place. These forms are fabulous, and we have ourselves engaged in a lot of performative issues with structure. But the question is, what is the carbon footprint of these buildings? So the issue kind of goes broader. I think the issue of performance has got definitely a moral underlining to that. So I would say you use parametric tools or not, but now you've got a much more precise tool palette to justify the things that we're doing. So if that makes it any more clear.
For the uninitiated, could you define what parametric design is?
Well, I think there's a difference between iterative and parametric. Like, I mean, if I want to be sort of more, parameters that talk to each other. And it's not like you send something and something comes back, but you embed like your DNA, you embed a criteria, and that criteria performs, and that changes. And instead of changing the form, you change the criteria that change the form. That is the true parametric understanding. Like you use the script, rather than manipulate the form, you change the script. And that script communicates to an environmental software that says, by doing that, you saved, or you did this. So that loop is, what it is, and that's complicated. It couldn't have been done 10 years ago.
Yeah,
or not in this fluidity, like there's software like CFD analysis that still is very cumbersome to do.
So logarithms playing a bigger role now
Well, architects have always designed to parameters, but now there's a digital platform which can measure and test everything, as he was saying. A way to visualize it, in my view, it's a simple way, but structural engineers have done parametric design for longer, in my view, than most architects, because they're doing things as basic as trying to distribute stresses through the structural frame of the building. And they'll just measure and then adjust and measure and adjust and measure and adjust. And now that can be done instantaneously. The humans can step away and the parameters will discuss it until they finally minimize it to as low as possible. And then you can step in and see what it is and see what it's done. And then as the architect, you can say, well, it's done that, but I want to do this. And you can start to talk to the tools and to the parameters.
So do you think performativity has will become invisible in the future in these buildings because it will be a given that we'll be calculating efficiencies, whether they're economic or carbon or structural?
I think performativity won't go away, and the power of the tools that are parametric won't go away. But I think that architects will always want to make their mark, and I don't want to open a whole nother conversation necessarily in the limitation of time we have, but there are people like Patrick Schumacher, parametric style, that believes it's morally correct to the representation of the building must also be parametric. So you have to ask yourself, the image of the building must be parametric. Now, that's not necessarily what either he said or what I said. We didn't talk about that. But there are those that feel that it must express the zeitgeist of the time. And if you can do all those things, then formally it's our job is to create form. Therefore, we must formally interpret all of this. And I think the verdict is out on that part.
Please, how do you compare the property value in LA with the property values in New York City?
I'm not sure I heard the question. How do
you compare the property value?
What value?
Property value.
Property values in LA versus New York? Well, they're improving in LA, but they've always been high. New York, San Francisco's close, but in the center of cities, Manhattan's property values are the highest. So that means the relative cost of the building is smaller in relation to the cost of the land, which is exceedingly high. So that causes people who build buildings to think about them differently, to do things that sometimes you won't do elsewhere in a city with lower property values. So there are a lot of reasons why New York, easy for me to say from where I sit when I'm in my office, to experiment, to be aggressive, to be bold. The world wants to come to the city. It's a very international city. The financial and services sector want to be here. You know, the city has been a leader, in my view. Every day hasn't been a good day, but been a leader in zoning and the views of sort of public space and public accessible space. The things that have happened in the last decade, the waterfronts, the development of that, the development. There's been a lot of real estate development, but on the other hand, from the outside, there's been an enormous amount of improvement to the public realm. And as New York has deindustrialized, and this is a huge statement, I know any of you can take issue with me on this, but as it's deindustrialized, it's done one of the best jobs of supplanting it with publicly accessible space and thinking about what that means, and the quickest job of it. And I know it's underway and it'll happen for decades. So.
Well, think about that as you walk across the street and along the Esplanade and take a look at the harbor and the river as you leave. But have a drink first. Ask your questions individually. Buy a book and have it signed, please. And let's thank Scott for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you. Good.